All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our TALMUD Torah sponsors for the month of Shat. Mrs. Bracha Strimber, in memory of her husband, Avi Strimber, Avraham ben Kálman, Eli'ezer, Halevi, Zichor Livracha. We hope that in merit of our TALMUD Torah, the Neshama have an aliyah and the family a nechama. And to thank Avi Tobias for dedicating all of the shiurim and drashos this month in honor of the shir, in honor of the daf. We thank Avi for his incredible generosity. So with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Lamed. A beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Lamed. We are picking up on Chav Tes Amud Beis 29b, and we left off at Meisvei. So we'll say Meisvei is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, about 18 lines up from the bottom. So just to reorient ourselves a little bit, we left off with an interesting machlokes. What was our machlokes? What is Parsha Shkalim? Which is a very interesting machlokes to have, right? Considering the Mishnah speaks out Parsha Shkalim, when do you read Parsha Shkalim, when do you skip, right? When is there a hafsaka? And now we get into, well, what is Parsha Shkalim? So for this we had a machlokes Rav and Shmuel. Rav says that it's what we call Tzav Es B'nei Yisrael, the V'amarta Lem Es Kamari Lachmi Li'ishai, which Rabbi say is the pasuk, or is the section in Bamidbar, Parshas Pinchas, that deals with the Karban Tamid, as well goes into Rosh Chodesh after that as well. We then Shmuel said, no, it is actually the section of the beginning of Parshas Kisisa that deals with the Machzis Hashakel. So we are now trying to go ahead and figure out that particular halacha. So Moses says, the Gemara Meisvei, Chalios beParsha Hasmucha La, Bein Bilfana Bein Malachara, Korin Osa, V'Koflin Osa. So also here's an interesting case. What happens if Parsha Shkalim, right, the actual Parsha Shkalim falls out in proximity to the actual week in which we read that Parshas HaShavua? So you'll see what I mean in just, in other words, I will say, Parsha Shkalim is part of a Parsha. It's part of a Parsha, right? So in other words, in essence, if you think about it, you read Parsha Shkalim twice, right? How do you read Parsha Shkalim twice? You read it once as Parsha Shkalim, a supplemental reading, but then you read it again how? As a regular Parshas HaShavua. What happens if the Parshas HaShavua and the supplemental reading of Parsha Shkalim coincide? So that's halacha, no problem. Korinosa, v'kolfinosa. You read it and you repeat it. So yeah, it could happen. We'll say in other words, it could happen that you could actually have a situation where what? Where the Parshas HaShavua and Parsha Shkalim themselves could be the same reading. To which the Gemara says, well, Bishlam Laman Damar Kisisa Hanudim Misramim Bahu Zimna. I will say, now that actually makes sense. When could that happen? By the way, I will say, this actually, it can't happen now, the way the calendar is set, but it could have happened before the calendar was set, because if you say that Parsha Shkalim is Parshas Kisisa, so Parshas Kisisa does fall out around the time, or can fall out around the time of Rosh Chodesh Adar. So you could have, it sounds crazy, but you could have a situation where the regular Parshas HaShavua would be what? Parshas Kisisa, and you would end up reading the supplemental reading of Parshas Shkalim that same week. Elaman Darat Savas Karbani Mim Misrami Bahu Zimna. Rabbi say, but if you hold that Parshas Shkalim is Parshas Bamidbar, then what, Rabbi say? There's no way that Parshas Bamidbar comes out around Purim. So how would that happen? Rabbi says, this is incredible. In B'bnei Ma'arava, the Maskila Oraisa Betlas Shneim. It can happen, Rabbi says. Where could it happen? We mentioned this a few days ago. It could happen in Eretz Yisrael. Because the minhag in Eretz Yisrael is that they did not finish reading the Torah every year, but rather they were on a 3-year rotation. Once every 3 years, they finished reading the Torah. And as such, you could have a situation where a Parshas Bamidbar can come out around Purim. Okay, Rabbi said there's a lot to speak about with that, but not our topic. Okay, possible. Tanya Kavasi Dishmos. Both of right that support Shmuel. Remember again, Shmuel holds that Parshas Shkalim is Parshas Kisisa. So where do you see this? Listen to this. Rosh Chodesh Adar Shchalios b'Shabbos. If Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out on Shabbos, Korin Kisisa umaftirin b'Yehoyada HaKohen. Right, Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out on Shabbos. So ultimately, again, we read Parshas Kisisa. That's Parshas Shkalim. And the Mahaftor of Yoyada HaKohen, or maybe Yitzchak Nafcha, Rosh Chodesh Adar Shchalios b'Shabbos. If Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out on Shabbos, so the point of that price is you see explicitly that what do we say? We say that Allah Chalamaisa Parshas Shkalim is Parshas Kisisa. Fine. So the Gemara says, if Amr Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha, Rosh Chodesh Adar, Shchalios b'Shabbos, if Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out on Shabbos, Motziin Shalosh Toros, we take out 3 Torahs, the Korin Bahen. Echad Binyan Shayom, one is the Parshas HaShavua, Ve'echad B'Shal Rosh Chodesh, one is the Rosh Chodesh reading, Ve'echad B'Chisisa, and one is Parshas Shkalim. So I will say, so once again, you seem to point into the idea that what is Parshas Shkalim? The beginning of Parshas Kisisa, a support to Shmuel. Van Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha, Rosh Chodesh Teves Shchalios B'Shabbos. If Rosh Chodesh Teves falls out on Shabbos, I will say, and I remember again, what happens if Rosh Chodesh Teves falls out on Shabbos? What do you have? You've got Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, and Chanukah. So Mavi and Shalosh Toros. We had this year, right? So we go ahead, right? You take out 3 Torahs. The Korin Bahen Echad Binyan Shayom. One of them you go and you read Parshas HaShavua. Ve'echad b'di Rosh Chodesh. One is Rosh Chodesh. Ve'echad b'Chanukah. And one is Chanukah. So I will say, so now, interestingly enough, now why do I need both of these cases? I will say, so the Gemara just illustrated the same thing in 2 cases. One was Rosh Chodesh Adar that falls on Shabbos. And if Rosh Chodesh Adar falls on Shabbos, also you have 3 Torahs. Parshas HaShavua, Rosh Chodesh, Parshas Shkalim. Same idea, if Rosh Chodesh Teves falls out on Shabbos, 3 Torahs, Parshas HaShavua, Rosh Chodesh, and Chanukah. So why does the Gemara need to bring down 3 cases of 3 Sifrei Torah? It's the same idea. If it would have just said this case, Rabbi Yitzchak, Ava Bahach Karav Sfirale, then my Parshas Shkalim is Kamani Lachmi Ubishtei Torah Sagi. So I will say you need both cases. Why? Because if it would have just said the Chanukah case, I would have said the Chanukah case is where you need 3 Torahs. Why? Parshas HaShavua, Rosh Chodesh, and Chanukah. But maybe Rosh Chodesh Adar that falls on Shabbos, I will say, interestingly enough, maybe you only need 2 Torahs. Now I will say, why would you only need 2 Torahs? Because according to Rav, the Kriya for Parshas, for Rosh Chodesh, and for Shkalim is what? Is the same. Kamash Mala, no, that we don't pass like Rav, we pass like Shmuel, and the Kriya for Shkalim and the Kriya for Rosh Chodesh are 2 different Kriyos. If that's the case, then just state the case by Rosh Chodesh Adar that falls on Shabbos, and leave off Chanukah. Chadam Nichlal Chaver Te'itmar. Alright, I will say Inachinami, we're just saying one is inferred by the other. In other words, once we start talking about cases of 3 Torahs, we get very excited. We're easily excitable bunch. And therefore, again, once I start speaking about 3 Torahs, I go ahead and mention all of the cases that talk about 3 Torahs. So I will say, the truth is there aren't so many cases that talk about 3 Torahs. There's really only Shabbos Chanukah and Rosh Chodesh Adar that falls out on a Shabbos. Those would be 3 cases. I will say, but again, for our purposes, what does this prove or who does this support? This supports the position of Shmuel, who holds that Parshas Shkalim is Parshas Kisisa and not like Rav. Because according to Rav, at least for Rosh Chodesh Adar that falls out on Shabbos, you would not need 3 Torahs. You would only need what? You would only need 2, because according to Rav, the reading for Shkalim and the reading for Rosh Chodesh are in fact the same Kriya. Good. Amr Yitzchak says, Itmar, Rosh Chodesh Teves Shchalios B'Shabbos. If Rosh Chodesh Teves falls on Shabbos, so we'll say back to Chanukah. Rosh Chodesh Teves falls out on Shabbos. Rosh Chodesh Teves Shchalios B'Chol. Rosh Chodesh Teves falls out during the week. Amr Yitzchak, so we'll say, so now here's the interesting part. What do you do when Rosh Chodesh Teves falls out during the week? What's my problem? I have, not problem, Chas v'Shalom, but what's the issue? I have Chanukah and Rosh Chodesh, but again, remember, this is a weekday reading. So whereas on Shabbos you can add on whatever you want, how do you deal with this on a weekday? So listen to this. Amr Yitzchak, Karu Tlasa b'Rosh Chodesh, v'chad b'Chanukah. Read 3 aliyahs in Rosh Chodesh and 1 aliyah on Chanukah. That's Rabbi Yitzchak's position. For Avdimi Dimin Chaifa Amar, Karu Tlasa b'Chanukah, v'chad b'Rosh Chodesh. No, read 3 aliyahs in Chanukah and 1 aliyah of Rosh Chodesh. So we'll say, what is everybody agreeing on? That's what? 4 aliyahs. Which is fine, because that's Chanukah, right? So 4 aliyahs. Right? Or Rosh Chodesh. What are we disagreeing on? We're disagreeing on the 3-1 split. Rabbi Yitzchak saying 3 for Rosh Chodesh, 1 for Chanukah. Rav Dimi, 3 for Chanukah, 1 for Rosh Chodesh. Amar Rav Mani, Kavasid Rabbi Yitzchak Nafka Mistabra. Rabbi Yitzchak seems to be right that it should be 3 Rosh Chodesh, 1 Chanukah. Why? Did Tadir V'Sheno Tadir, Tadir Kodem. Both say, no, whenever you have a doubt, you always fall back. No, both say there are certain trusted principles that when you hear them, it's like seeing an old friend, right? You see an old friend, you feel a sense of comfort. You hear Tadir V'Sheno Tadir, Tadir Kodem. Tadir is always there to save us in cases of doubt. What do? Tadir V'Sheno Tadir, Tadir Kodem. Rosh Chodesh comes more often than Chanukah, and therefore, again, Rabbi say it makes sense to say, like Rabbi Yitzchak, 3 aliyos in Rosh Chodesh, 1 aliyah in Chanukah. No, I think that's like Rav Dimi. Why? So the Gemara, listen to this. Mi garam l'Ravi Sheyavel. Who causes the fourth aliyah to come? Rosh Chodesh. So Chanukah by itself will just get 3 aliyahs. Right, so ultimately, who quote unquote causes the fourth aliyah? The fourth aliyah is caused by Rosh Chodesh. Therefore, Hilchach Revi Rosh Chodesh by Mikri. So therefore, again, really the fourth aliyah should be Rosh Chodesh. Okay, so my Havi Allah. Supposed to say, what's the halacha? What's the halacha? Rav Yosef Amra in Mashkichim Rosh Chodesh. Rav Yosef says we don't pay attention to Rosh Chodesh, and ultimately, which means that the primary kriya is Chanukah. 3 from Chanukah, 1 for Rosh Chodesh. But Rabba Amar Ein Mashkichen b'Chanukah, and Rabba says no, quote unquote, we don't pay attention to Chanukah, and therefore it's 3 Rosh Chodesh, 1 Chanukah. V'Hilchasa Ein Mashkichen b'Chanukah, v'Rosh Chodesh Sheker. And Rabba say the halacha is we don't, quote unquote, we don't pay attention to Chanukah, and Rosh Chodesh is Iker, like Rabbi Yitzchak. And therefore Rabba say, and this is indeed how we pass halacha l'maisa, that when Rosh Chodesh Teves falls out during the week, we read 3 aliyos from the kriya of Rosh Chodesh and 1 aliyah from the entire kriya of Chanukah. That is the halacha. Itmar chalios beve'ata tetzaveh. Supposed to say, interesting case. Now, what happens? Watch this case. I'm supposed to say this actually can happen. I'm supposed to say what happens if Parshas Shkalim falls out on Parshas Tetzaveh. Now, I'm supposed to say, so remember again, what's unique about this? Tetzaveh is what? Is the week before Kisisa, right? So I will say, so in this case over here, what's happening? So Parshas Hashavua is falling out right before what would be Parshas Shkalim. So now, what do I do on Shabbos Tetzaveh? So watch this. I'm going to be tzog nafka. Karu shisa meve'ata Tetzaveh ad Kisisa. You read 3 aliyos, so we'll essentially read all the Parshas Tetzaveh in 6 aliyos up until Parshas Kisisa. V'chad mechisisa ad va'asisa, and then read the 7th aliyah from the beginning of Parshas Kisisa, Parshas Shkalim. Amra Abaye will say, top of Lamed, Amri akume hu da kamok mi hasam. So we'll say, look at Rashi, what does that mean? Look at Rashi for just a moment. Amri akumi hu demuk mi hasam, kilomar, ena davar nikar l'shim Parshas Shkalim, ela sabri shlo nestaima Parshas va'ata tzavad kan. We'll say, Abaye said, here's the problem. You can't do that. Why? Because what does it look like? People aren't going to realize that 7th aliyah is Parshas Kisisa. Instead, what are they just going to think it is? They're just going to think it's a continuation of Parshas Tetzav. In other words, remember, what's unique about this case is the Parshas HaShavua happens to just chronologically go into Parshas Shkalim. So if you just read, Abai says, if you just read 6 from Tetzaveh, 7th aliyah from Kisisa, and there's nothing recognizable, people are just going to think that Kisisa is the continuation of Tetzaveh. But we'll say, you have to, again, remember, this goes back to what we constantly refer back to, which is, you have your Chumash, right? So you have your Chumash that says Parshas Tetzaveh, then Parshas Kisisa, and you have your note in the margin that says, Parshas Shkalim. But remember, again, they're just listening al peh, so they're not going. Abai says they're not going to hear anything recognizably different. Abai says, here's what you should do. Rather, Abai said this, it's actually very interesting. Read 6 aliyos from Tetzaveh into the beginning of Parshas Kisisa. In other words, read 6 aliyos through the beginning of Parshas Kisisa, up until the pasuk of Vasisa Kiyar Nechoshes, up until the making of the Kiyar, which is a couple of psukim already into Parshas Kisisa, which for us is the end of Parshas Shkalim. And then what? And then V'chad Tani V'kari Nirchisisa Ad V'asisa. So we'll say, listen to this. Abai says, then what do you do? So in other words, read 6 aliyos from the beginning of Tetzaveh into Parshas Kisisa, and aliyah number 7, go back and read from the beginning of Parshas Kisisa. In other words, reread the beginning of Parshas Kisisa. When people see you rereading Parshas Kisisa, they will understand that what? What are you doing? That's Parshas Shkalm. And I want to point out, the only reason why they're having this discussion is because Parshas HaShavua comes right before Parshas Kisisa. In a different week, this wouldn't come up because it'd be recognizable that the supplemental reading is Parshas Shkalim. What we're concerned about over here is that people aren't going to realize that there's a supplemental reading, and they're just going to think that Parshas Tetzaveh kind of bleeds into Parshas Kisisa. So therefore, Abaye says, read 6 aliyos, go from the beginning of Tetzaveh into Kisisa, and then for the 7th aliyah, reread the beginning of Parshas Kisisa as Parshas Shkalim. So you're repeating something you already read. By repeating something you already read, people will see, that's a supplemental reading. I will say, by the way, also, don't get thrown off by the 6th aliyah, 7th aliyah. Obviously, they're espousing a little bit of a different model. We read Parshas Kisisa or Parshas Shkalim as a maftir, right? Not they're looking at it as one of the aliyos, but don't worry about that. Meisvei chalios Parshas Muchala bein milfana bein milachareha. If Parshas Shkalim falls out, literally again, the Parshas HaShavua, in other words, literally the Parshas Kisisa would be read the week before or the week after. So the Gemara says, Korin osa v'koflin osa. We read it and we repeat it. So according to Abaye, this makes sense. According to Abaye, this makes sense. But El Rabbi Yitzchak nafcha kasha. But according to Rabbi Yitzchak, what would he do with this? Rabbi Yitzchak nafcha ula Abaye minecha. Does this make sense? Teinach lefanah. This makes sense ultimately again if it comes before Parshas Kisisa lachareh hechi mishkachos la. How would you ever have it if it comes afterwards? Elamai istacha lemimar kofla bishabasos. Hachanami kofla bishabasos. Ultimately, again, it must be that. What if you look at Rashi? Rashi says kofla bishabasos, second white line. Shikarnoso shtei shabasos zu achar zu. That what it means, Rabbosai, is, and by the way, we have this. You could have a situation where you're reading Parshas Kisisa 2 weeks in a row. Right? How could you have that? Where Rabbosai, 1 week you're reading Parshas Kisisa as Parshas Shkalim, and then you could be, how it often happens, that you're first reading it as Parshas Shkalim, and then you're reading actual Parshas HaShavua later on, a week or two, or the week later. Fine. Chalios b'chisisa atzma. So we'll say ultimately again. So again, this whole discussion for us is a bit academic because remember we have the parshos split up a little bit differently. So if you would have a situation where Tetzaveh would fall out the week before Kisisa, remember again in general, what are we doing? We're reading 7 aliyos from Tetzaveh and a maftir from Kisisa. So the fact that the maftir, remember again, we use the supplemental readings as a maftir, not as an aliyah. So the fact that I'm using it as a maftir, in and of itself, distinguishes it, and everyone understands that it is a supplemental reading. Good. Chalios b'chisisa, atzma. Let's say, watch this case. What happens if Parshas Shkalim actually falls out on Parshas Kisisa? Which again, calendrically now for us cannot happen, but was able to happen before the calendar was set. So now I will say, what do you do in a situation like this? Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha says something very interesting. Essentially, he says, you begin the reading of Parshas HaShavua, not from the beginning of the Parsha, but you begin the first aliyah, you skip the first part of the Parsha, which is what we call Parshas Shkalim, right? You've skipped that part, begin Rishon from a couple of Pesukim into the Parsha, and read up to Vayakel, and then, V'chad Kari, Mechisisa Ad Va'asisa, and then go back for the last aliyah, and read the first part of the Parsha. Maskifla Abaye is going to say, what? Amri the Mafreyahu Dekari? That's ridiculous. You're going to read the Parsha out of order? That makes no sense. Ela Amr Abaye, here's what you do. Karu Shisa Ad Vayakel, read 6 aliyos from the beginning of the Parsha to the end of the Parsha. V'chad Tani V'kari Mechisisa Va'adasisa, and just reread the first aliyah. Reread the first aliyah. Tanya Kavasi the Abaye Chalios B'chisisa. Atzma korin osa v'kolflin osa. So I will say, and again, that indeed was the halacha. If it turned out that Parshas Shkalim fell out on Parshas Kisisa, which I will say again cannot happen presently, but again, when it was able to happen, what would you do? Read the entire Parsha from beginning Kisisa until Vayakel. Read the entire Parsha, split it up into 6 aliyos, and then reread the 7th aliyah from what? the first part of the parsha, which is Parshas Kisisa, Parsha Shkalim. Beautiful. We'll say second wide line. Chalios b'soch HaShabbos makdim l'Shabbos sha'avra. So we'll say, remember, get back to the Mishnah. What did the Mishnah say? If Rosh Chodesh Adar fell out during the week, when do you read Parsha Shkalim? We'll say, when do you read Parsha Shkalim? The Shabbos before. Remember, Parsha Shkalim is always read the Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh Adar. The only exception to that rule is when Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out on Shabbos itself. Then you would read Parsha Shkalim on Rosh Chodesh Adar. But if Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out during the week, you go ahead and you advance the reading of Shkalim to the Shabbos before. Itmar, Rosh Chodesh Adar Shchalios Be'erev Shabbos. We'll say, what happens in the following case? What do you do? So we'll say, the Lashon of the Mishnah is very interesting. The Lashon of the Mishnah is Chalios B'soch HaShabbos. So how do you translate that phrase literally? If Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out when? B'soch. Now we'll say, the Gemara says B'soch means like the middle of the week or during the week. What happens if Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out on Friday? Chalios. So Itmar Rosh Chodesh Adar Chalios Be'erev Shabbos. Rav Amar Makdimin. Rav says, well, we read Parsha Shkalim on the Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh. Ushmuel Amar Ma'acharin. Very interesting. Shmuel says, no, that halacha l'maisa, in that case, you're going to read Parsha Shkalim that Shabbos following Rosh Chodesh. Right? That Shabbos following. So Rosh Chodesh will be on Friday, and you'll read Parsha Shkalim that Shabbos. Rav Amar Makdimin. Rav says we advance the reading, right? We read the Shabbos before. Then came Batzri Lohu Yomi Shulchanos. We also remember again, we saw in yesterday's daf that ultimately, again, we want to give 2 weeks. We want to give remember, we'll say, we had the idea that halacha l'maisa, we should give a month for people to go ahead and get their machzis shekel in. Right? 30 days. 30 days is the amount of time that people need to get their act together. I will say, Halavai only took 30 days for us to get our act together, right? What good shape I'd be in if that was true. But at least for Shkalim, right? At least to get my new half shekel in, 30 days. Rabbi Yehuda said, no, you only need 15 days. 2 weeks, right? 15 days. That was saying that even according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says that halacha l'maisa, you only need 2 weeks, we still want to go ahead and read Parsha Shkalim on the week before Rosh Chodesh Adar. Why? Because remember, again, the money changers set up their tables 2 weeks after Rosh Chodesh Adar, 2 weeks before Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So the Gemara says like this. So watch this. So Rav says, even when Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out on Friday, we're going to read the previous Shabbos, because if not, by the time we go ahead and read Parsha Shkalim, it's less than 2 weeks to give people notice that the money changers are setting up their tables. So the Gemara says, Shmuel says ma'acharin. Shmuel says, no, we can wait till Shabbos. Why? Sof chameser b'ma'ale Shabbos mikla. U'shulchanos lo nafki ad chad b'shaba. Hilchach ma'acharin. Shmuel says it's not a problem, because Shmuel says, play this out. If Rosh Chodesh is Friday, and ultimately again you wait to read Parsha Shkalim until that Shabbos, the money changers anyway wouldn't really be setting up their tables until when? 2 weeks from that Sunday. See, either way, you still have 2 weeks. Okay, so Tzanan, Chalios B'soch HaShabbos, if Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out during the week, because it's Mishnah, Makdimin L'Sha'avar. We go ahead and we advance the reading to the previous Shabbos, Parsha Shkalim, Umafsikin L'Shabbos HaChares. And we'll say, when you have a situation like that you read Parsha Shkalim before Rosh Chodesh Adar, you're going to have one Shabbos without a supplemental reading, right? So the Gemara says, because remember again, the next time we're going to have a supplemental reading is when? What's after Shkalim? Is Zachar. And when is Zachar read? On the Shabbos immediately preceding Purim. So therefore again, if Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out during the week, and you read Parsha Shkalim the week before, that usually means the next Shabbos you're not going to be reading any supplemental reading. And then the following Shabbos after that, you read Parsha Zachar. So the Gemara says, so Makdim l'Shavar, Mafsik l'Shabbos Achares, Ma'ila b'afilu be'erev Shabbos. Doesn't this even mean that even when Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out on a Friday, we go ahead and we advance the reading to the previous Shabbos? Lo b'socha Shabbos dafka. No, maybe not. Maybe this halacha of advancing Parsha Shkalim to the previous Shabbos only applies when Rosh Chodesh Mamash falls out during the week. And during the week, Rabbi Osai, means on any other day other than Friday. But if Rosh Chodesh Adar is falling out on Friday, when you're such proximity to Shabbos, in that case, we'll read Parsha Shkalim on the Shabbos actually following Rosh Chodesh Adar, the next day. Tashma, Ezu Shabbos Rishona. What's the first Shabbos ultimately? Again, that we read one of the supplemental readings. Kol Shechar Rosh Chodesh Ad Lios Besocha. Any week in which Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out during it. Va'afilu be'erev Shabbos. Right? Va'afilu be'erev Shabbos. My love, afilu be'erev Shabbos dumya desocha. Don't we say, therefore, again, if Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out on Shabbos, Erev Shabbos, it's the same halacha that if it fell out on any other day during the week. How so? Masocha makdimin. Just like when Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out in the middle of the week, we advance Parsha Shkalim to the previous Shabbos of Erev Shabbos makdimin. So too, even when Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out on Erev Shabbos, we advance the reading. We advanced the reading earlier, to which the Gemara says, not necessarily Amar Shmuel ba. The Chaim Tana de Shmuel ba. Not necessarily, say, rather it could very well mean that halacha lemaisa, the only time we will advance the reading is when halacha lemaisa, look at Rashi, Amar Shmuel hay besocha diktani lav toch shavua ela toch Shabbos atzmo. No. What are we talking about when it says besocha Shabbos? Could very well mean that's referring to when Rosh Chodesh falls out on Shabbos itself. In other words, the both say that you could have three different situations. Essentially, if Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out on Shabbos, when do you read Shkalim? On Shabbos. If Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out during the week, when do you read Shkalim? When do you read Shkalim the previous Shabbos? And potentially, the Gemara is entertaining, if Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out on Friday, when do you read Shkalim? The Shabbos following that Friday. Right? In other words, the next day. So Tanya, so the Gemara says, Kitanoi. In reality, this whole thing is a machlokas. So we'll say it's very interesting. We're getting all wrapped up in one very specific case, which is Rosh Chodesh Adar's falling out on a Friday. So do we look at that as Rosh Chodesh Adar falling out any other time during that week? In which case, we'll read Parsha Shkalim on the previous Shabbos, or for some reason is Rosh Chodesh Adar falling out on Friday, a different animal, which will then lead us to actually read Parsha Shkalim on the next day, on the Shabbos following Rosh Chodesh. That's the machlokes. So it says, the Gemara Kitana, it's machlokes tanaim, misargin l'shabbosos. So we'll say, ultimately, again, misargin means we alternate. Serigin. Misargin l'shabbosos, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Rabbi Shimon Elazar Omer, in misargin. No, we'll say, if you look at Rashi's Lashon, Serigin, Kilomar, mafsikin l'shabbosos, bein parsha, Rishon l'shniya. Ultimately, again, there are circumstances where there will be a hefsek, there will be an interruption between Parsha Shkalim and Parsha Zachar. Rabbi Shimon Elazar says, "Ein misargin." Rabbi Shimon Elazar says, when do we say in misargin that we don't alternate? When Rabbi say, don't we alternate? In a case, we're listening to this, in a case where halacha l'maisa, Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out on Erev Shabbos. Because in that case, according to what will you say, you read Parsha Shkalim on the next day, on the Shabbos after Rosh Chodesh, and then Rabbi say what that would mean is when do you read Parsha Zachar? The following Shabbos, in which case there's no alternating. Aval Bisman Shechal Besocha Shabbos, but Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out during the week. Maktim B'Korei Mishabbos Sha'avra Afa Pishu Shvat. We'll read Parsha Shkalim the previous Shabbos, even though it is still Chodesh Shvat. So we'll say, how do we pass in halacha l'maisa? For our purposes, Rabbi will say there is no difference if Rosh Chodesh falls out on a Friday or if Rosh Chodesh falls out on a Wednesday. It's always the same halacha. Whenever Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out during the week, we always read Parsha Shkalim on the previous Shabbos. The only exception to that rule is what? When Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out when? On Shabbos itself, in which case then we'll go ahead and we'll read Parsha Shkalim on that Shabbos, and that'll be a case of 3 Sifrei Torah. Right? Again, Parsha Hashavua, Rosh Chodesh, and Parsha Shkalim. Beautiful. But so let's go weiter. Says the Gemara, B'Shniya Zachar. Remember again, on the second Shabbos, which means on the second supplemental reading, is Parsha Zachar. Again, remember, Parsha Zachar details the war with Amalek and gives us the obligation to remember Amalek. We always read this on the Shabbos before Purim, because remember again, Haman is a descendant of the nation of Amalek. So Itmar, Purim Shchalios Be'erev Shabbos. What happens when Purim falls out on a Friday? Rav Amar, Makdimin Parsha Zachar. So we'll say, watch this. Rav says, we'll read Parsha Zachar on the previous Shabbos. Right? So Purim falls out on a Friday. We're still going to read Parsha Zachar on the previous Shabbos. So Shmuel says, no, Ma'achrin. In that case, we'll say, interestingly enough, when Purim falls out on a Shabbos, what we're going to do is we're going to read Parsha Zachar on actually the next day. on the day after Purim. So the Gemara says, Rav Makdimin Keichid Lo Tiknum Asiya L'Zechira. So Rav says, no, you have to read Parsha Zachar on the Shabbos before Purim in order that what? In order that the performance of Purim not precede the performance not precede the remembrance. In other words, it makes sense to say, remember Amalek before the celebration of Purim. Shmuel says, we know we delay it. So Amelcha Kevan Deika Mukafin, the Avdi Bichamesar, Asiya Uzechira Bahadi Hadadi Kasi. I will say, and I remember again, when they speak about Purim falling out on Friday, which date is falling out on Friday? The 14th. Which means that technically speaking, Shabbos is also still Purim. Now we have this already. Remember again, even though in that case, one of the walled cities is going to celebrate Purim, when are they going to celebrate? On Erev Shabbos also, right? They're going to celebrate on Friday also. Because remember, you can't go to Sunday. You can't go to Sunday because Sunday is the 16th already, and we don't celebrate Purim on the 16th. So they'll push it back. But nevertheless, calendrically, the 15th is Purim. And I both say the truth is the concept of a Purim Meshulash, of the 16 celebrating pieces of Purim as well, we have that concept in Halacha. But for our purposes now, just understand, the Gemara is looking at it, the 14th is Purim, the 15th is calendrical Purim, so therefore Shmuel will say that Halacha Lamai says no problem reading Parshas Zachar on that Shabbos. There's no problem because that's Purim and Parshas Zachar coinciding with one another. So the Gemara says as follows. Good. So Tanan, B'shniya Zachar, on the second Shabbos, we'll read Parsha Zachar. So the Gemara says, V'haki mikla reisharcha b'Shabbos, but ultimately, again, let's analyze this. When Rosh Chodesh falls out, if Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out on Shabbos, then what? Mikla Purim be'erev Shabbos. The 14th of Adar will fall out on Erev Shabbos. The Katani b'Shniya Zachar. And yet we're saying that on the second Shabbos we read Parsha Zachar, which would seem to put Parsha Zachar actually on the Friday, or on the Shabbos, before Purim, which would seem to support Rav and against Shmuel. So Amar Papa, my Shniya, what does Shniya mean? Shniya lahafsaka. It means the second Shabbos after we didn't have a supplemental reading. Okay, so Tashma, Ezer Shabbos Shniya, what's the second Shabbos? Kol shechal Purim lios b'socha. That's the week that Purim fell out during it. Va'afilu b'erev Shabbos, even if Purim falls out on Shabbos. So my love, erev Shabbos dumi d'socha. So aren't we saying that whether Purim falls out on erev Shabbos or Purim falls out during the week, it's the same halacha? Masocha makdimin, just like if Purim falls out during the week. We read Parsha Zachar on the Shabbos before Purim. Af erev Shabbos makdimin. So too, if Purim falls out on erev Shabbos, we'll still read Parsha Zachar the Shabbos before. Amr Shmuel ba. Shmuel says no, it's talking about a case where actually Purim's falling out on Shabbos itself. Shmuel ba. Okay. Chalios b'Shabbos atzma. What happens if Purim falls out on Shabbos itself? Amr Rav Huna. The divrei akol in makdimin. Rav Huna will say in that case everyone agrees that we read Parsha Zachar on that Shabbos, and we will not advance the reading to the previous Shabbos. So said Rav Nachman Amar Daini Machlokes. Rav Nachman will say no, it is still a Machlokes. Itmar Nami Amar Rav Chibar Abba Amar Abba Amar Rav Purim Shechalios b'Shabbos Makdim v'Korei b'Shabbos She'avra Zachar. So we'll say here he says that when Purim falls out on Shabbos, we still read Parsha Zachar on the previous Shabbos. So we'll say how do we paskin halacha l'maisa? We paskin like Rav, and therefore Rabbi say it's a very interesting, important halacha. Even when Purim falls out on Shabbos, right? Even when Purim falls out on Shabbos, we always read Parsha Zachar on the Shabbos preceding Purim. Again, I both say, so it should begin to see it's the same halacha. In other words, the Gemara tries to make a distinction when certain major events occur on a Friday versus during the week, right? So now this is our second time. If Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out during the week, everyone agrees Parsha Shkalim on the previous Shabbos. What happens if Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out on a Friday? So halacha l'maisa, what we say is there's no difference if Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out on a Friday or a Wednesday. You're always going to read Parsha Shkalim when? On the Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh Adar. Same thing by Purim. Whether Purim falls out, quote unquote, during the week, or Purim falls out on a Friday, Parsha Zachar is always going to be read on the Shabbos preceding Purim. Beautiful. B'shlishis Paraduma. Both say the third supplemental reading is the Parshas Para, who seeks out Paraduma, which I will say, remember again, Paraduma purifies a person from ritual impurity contracted from contact with a corpse. We read that on the Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Ultimately, again, as a way of reminding ourselves that Allah we have to be in a state of ritual purity for Pesach. So turn up on Ezu Shabbos Lishis. What's the third Shabbos? Kol shesmucha lePurim me'achareh. We'll say the third Shabbos is always the Shabbos after Purim. Itmar Rabbi Chama Bar Chanina Amar Shabbos hasmucha l'Rosh Chodesh. None of the others say it's the Shabbos that's next to Rosh Chodesh Nisan. V'lo pligi hadik l'Rosh Chodesh Nisan b'Shabbos hadik l'Bemtza Shabbos. So we'll say everything depends on when Rosh Chodesh Nisan falls out. But for our purposes, the easier way to remember it is Parshas Parah is always read on the Shabbos after Purim. Beautiful. But Revi'as HaChodesh, we'll say on the fourth Shabbos, which is the Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh Nisan, we read Parshas HaChodesh, which speaks, we'll say this week's Parsha, last week's Parsha, HaChodesh HaZalachem, Satan Rabbanon, Rosh Chodesh Adar Shechalios B'Shabbos. If Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out on Shabbos, Korin Kisisa, Umaftirin B'Yehoyada. So we'll say, if Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out on Shabbos, remember again, we'll say, we just said this, what are you doing? How many Torahs are you taking out on Rosh Chodesh Adar that falls on Shabbos? How many Torahs? 3. Parshas HaShavua, Rosh Chodesh, and Parshas Shkalim. Says the Gemara, Vafilu Be'erev Shabbos. And this is true even if Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out on Erev Shabbos. B'shniya, now we'll say if it falls out on Rosh Chodesh, obviously if it falls out on Rosh Chodesh, if Rosh Chodesh falls on Erev Shabbos, you're not taking out 3 Sifrei Torah. This reflects the view that when Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out on Erev Shabbos, you read Parshas Shkalim on the following Shabbos. We don't pass like that. B'shniya, the second Shabbos, Zachar, read Parshas Zachar, Umaftir Pakarati, Veizu Shabbos Shniya. What's the second Shabbos? Kol Shechal Purim Lios Bisocha, Ba'afilu Be'erev Shabbos. I will say that's ultimately, again, that's the second Shabbos. That's the second Shabbos. That's the week in which Purim falls out during the week, even if Purim falls out on a Friday. B'shlishes, on the third week, Para Aduma, you read Parshas Para, Umaftirin V'zarakti Alechem. Ve'ezu Shabbos, we'll say, what's the third week? Kol Shesmucha LePurim Me'achareha. The third week is the Shabbos that falls out after Purim. Berevius Chodesh Hazeh, read Parshas HaChodesh, Umaftirin Ko Amar Hashem Elokim, right Berishon Be'echad HaChodesh, V'amid Beis, Ve'ezo Hi Shabbos Revius, and what's the fourth Shabbos? Shabbos saying, Kol Shachal Rosh Chodesh Nisan Lios V'socha, V'afilu Be'erev Shabbos. That's the week in which Rosh Chodesh Nisan falls out, even if it falls out on a Friday. So we'll say, this is actually a great brisa, because this outlines, and I will say now again, you know this already, the brisa framed this as 4 consecutive weeks. But in fact, it's not really 4 consecutive. It doesn't happen as often. There's a lapse in between. So remember again, you're reading Parshas Shkalim on the Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh Adar. You're reading again Parshas Zachar on the Shabbos before Purim. You're reading Parshas Para on the Shabbos after Purim, and you're reading Parshas HaChodesh on the Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh Nisan. That's the model. Beautiful. Says the Gemara, very exciting. Says the Gemara, B'chamishes chozun lechasidron. Supposed to now watch this. On the 5th week, we go back to life, back to normal. Right? We go back to regular kriyas. Says the Gemara, l'seder mai. We see to the regular order of what? So Rabbi Ami Amar l'seder parashas suchoser. Rabbi Ami says you go back to the regular parashas hashavua. Rabbi Yirmiyah Amar l'seder haftorah suchoser. No. What it means is you're going back to the regular seder of haftorah. So I was saying that if you look at Rashi says over here the seder parashas. Supposed to say in the wide lines, about 10 lines in. Shebeshavos halalu hafsiku seder parashios delo karu ela araposhas. I was saying now here we get into a fascinating machlokes. See, I will say up until now I've been slanting the conversation a little bit. Why? Because we know that halacha lamaisa, the Dalet Parshios, are supplemental readings, which means they come on top of the regular Parshas HaShavua. But I will say there is an opinion of Rabbi Ami and others who hold that on the weeks of the Dalet Parshios, you're not reading the regular weekly Parsha. All you're reading is the supplemental reading. And therefore, again, when the Mishnah says that on the 5th week, you go back to the normal order, Rabbi Ami actually says, what's the normal order? Parshas HaShavua. Once again, you'll start reading a regular Parshas HaShavua. Rabbi Yirmiyah says, no, we've been reading Parshas HaShavua the whole time. What does it mean we go back to the normal order of things? What does that refer to? Haftorahs. Why? Because halacha l'maisa, the only thing that what happens on the Dalet Parshos is you're reading something supplemental, an additional kriya, plus a special haftorah. So says the Gemara, Amar Abaye, Kavasi Rabbi Ami Mistabra. I think Rabbi Ami is right. Why? It's not because what do we say in the Mishnah? Lakom afsikin, right? We go ahead and we disrupt the normal order for everything. L'Rosh Chadashim, l'Chanukah, u'lePurim, l'Taneus, l'Ma'amad, l'Kippurim. So Bishon l'Mandar, let's say the Parashiosu Chozer, Hainu Di'ika Parasha B'chol. So we'll say, according to the opinion, Rabbi Ami who holds that in the 5th week we go back to the regular Parashios. So ultimately, again, this is where you have a situation where the weekday reading can be replaced. So the Gemara says, Elman Amar, let's say there Haftorah Suchozer, Haftorah B'chol Mi'ika. So we'll say, again, but according to the opinion, it says that it's only the Haftorahs that are disrupted, but the regular Kriya is the same. Then I will say, how would this work when these events fall out during the week? In other words, the Mishnah said that when any of these special events occur, or special days occur, Rosh Chodesh, Chanukah, Purim, Tanios, Ma'amados, Yom Kippur, we suspend the regular reading and replace it with a new reading. That makes sense, even when these events fall out during the week. But if we're talking about only Haftorahs are changed, but the regular readings remain, where do you ever have Haftorahs during the week? To which the Gemara says, V'idach, and Rabbi Yirmiyah will say, Ha-kid'isa v'ha-kid'isa. Ultimately, you're going to say, again, remember, there's two different halachas over here. There's what you do when special occasions fall out on Shabbos, and there's what you do when special occasions fall out when? During the week. And it's two different halachas. When special I'm calling it special occasions, but you understand what I mean. Unique occasions fall out during the week. Often, the regular weekday reading will be totally and fundamentally replaced. Whereas some of those same special occasions fall out on Shabbos, what happens? The regular Parashas HaShavua is read, but what occurs? A supplemental reading is added. Two different situations. To which the Gemara says, but let me ask you. Says the Gemara, but B'tanios lama li'afsaka. But I will say, if let's say again a fast day falls out during the week, why do you need to stop reading the regular reading? Let's say a fast day falls out on a Monday or a Thursday. Why do you have to stop the regular reading? Why not continue? Likri mitzafra be'inyana diyoma or b'mincha b'tanisa. Why don't you read in the morning the regular? So let's say there was to be a fast day on this week on Monday at Parshas B'Shalach. So the Mishnah says, well, what would happen in that situation is, don't read the regular reading, right? So you wouldn't read Parshas B'Shalach in the morning, you would just read that day the Kriyas Torah for a Tainus. Why? Why not go ahead and just read the regular reading, Parshas Shavua, in the morning, right? And go ahead and read the special reading for the Tainus in the afternoon. To which the Gemara says, this is actually an incredible Gemara. Misayeya le l'Rafuna. The Rambam of Rabbi says, a very moving Gemara. What was the order for a fast day? Rabbi say, listen to this is really incredible. Mitzafra, Rabbi say, listen to how they used to structure public fast days. Mitzafra kinufya. In the morning already, they would be gathered. Rashi says, Mitzafra kinufya, masifin b'nei adam ubolkin umashirin, em yesh biyadam avera, v'yachtelu k'dei she'izkav l'hatainis. Lefichach ein p'nai b'shachris l'kros v'torah. Rabbi said, on a fast day, there was no time for Kriyas Torah in the morning. Rabbi say, why not? Because what would they be doing in the morning of a fast day? The entire town would be gathered. And Rabbi say, what would they be doing? A cheshbon ha'nefesh. The town people would be gathered, and there would be communal introspection. Let's look into ourselves, because Rabbi said, remember, why are you declaring a fast day? Usually because what? It could be either rain, something is going wrong. But Rabbi say, with the way you have to sometimes reflect to when things are going wrong, is you have to introspect. See, I will say, this is the interesting thing theologically. Sometimes when things go wrong, it's because of something I'm doing. Sometimes it's not because of something I'm doing. I will say, we have the concept in life of tzaddik v'ralo. I could be doing, quote unquote, everything right in life, but things still don't go according to plan. That does happen. But I will say, but when negative things happen in life, the first thing I really have to do is I have to introspect. That's the first order of business. Because I have to think about, could it be that what's occurring to me is because of something that I'm not doing correctly? Something misfiring left. Now again, I want to be very clear. It doesn't always work that way. Very often, again, HaKadosh Baruch Hu visits circumstances upon us for a whole variety of different reasons. But my first response to setback, to tragedy, to adversity, has to be introspection. Has to be, What could it be that there's something I'm doing that has brought this about? Then Rabbi said, can you imagine the scene in a communal fast day? What are they doing in the morning? Kinufia. Everybody gets together. Everybody gets together. And what's the point? Let's all introspect. Rabbi said, have you ever heard about a thing like this? Right? Let's all introspect together. We'll say, can you imagine, by the way, how vulnerable a person has to make themselves in a situation like that? Because if you look at Rashi, again, Rashi's lashon over here, it's in the wide lines, about 15 lines up from the bottom. Ma'asfin b'nei adam ubodkin umashirin. Right? They introspect. Im yesh biyadam aveira. And now again, I will say, lav dafka that they were doing this in public, right? But let me see differently. They were doing this in public. I don't know that it means everybody is announcing their sins in public, because right, you're not supposed to do that actually. But the idea is all of us gather, and the whole point over here is just introspection. Let's look into our lives and try to figure out, is something broken? Is something wrong? And if there is, how can we fix it? Because maybe if we do that, we could turn this circumstance. I will say, can you imagine having such an asifa like that? Where all of us get together, there's no talking, there's no nothing. Maybe there's a little bit of singing, because that could be helpful in allowing a person to be introspective. And mamish, the entire avoda is, let's look into ourselves. Let's each of us look into ourselves. Let's try to find something that's wrong, something that's broken, and let's be makabel to fix that which is broken within ourselves. I think we should do this. Not now, but we'll finish the daf first. But I think I will say, I think it's kedai, really, in all seriousness, to create and to emulate an avoda like this, of just getting together for the sake of creating an avirah, an atmosphere that is conducive to introspection. It's incredible. So the Gemara goes right there. From the morning until midday, they would go ahead and introspect and think about communal matters. On a communal level, is there anything we're doing wrong? We'll say from midday, for the next quarter of the day, they would read from the Torah and half Torah. And the last quarter of the day, they would daven. Shneimar, Pasuk says, Vayakumu alamdam, vayikaru b'sefer Torah Hashem Elokeim, Revius Hayom, or Revius Misvadin u'mishtachavim la'Hashem Elokeichem. So the Pasuk itself says, for a quarter of the day you read from the Torah, for a quarter of the day you go ahead and you daven. So the Gemara says, the epoch ana, in other words, how do you know which quarter to use for tefillah, which quarter to use for kriya? In other words, the way they set it up is the first half a day. First part of the day is everybody's gathered and introspects individually. Then again, still part of the first half of the day, they get together, think about communal matters. What do we need to tackle? What do we need to do? What do we need to address? From midday to the next quarter, they would Kriyas HaTorah, half Torah, and then the last quarter of the day they would daven. To which the Gemara says, well, how do you know you're not supposed to reverse those two quarters? Lo sakadaytcha dichsiv, Pasuk says, Ve'elai ya'asofu kol chorei b'divrei Elokei Yisrael, al me'al agola v'ani yoshe mishomim ad leminchas ha'erev. Shabbos, you see over here the lashon over here, uksiv u'b'minchas ha'erev kamti mitanesi. You see over here ultimately again that tefillah takes place ad minchas ha'erev, or leminchas ha'erev, from mincha up until the evening. And Rabbi say, so therefore again, just before I get to this is why, by the way, halacha l'maisa, the Gemara says there essentially was no Torah reading on the morning of a public fast day. Why was there no Torah reading, Rabbi say? Because they were busy with other things. The only kriya that took place was in the afternoon by mincha time, and that was the kriya of a fast day. But Rabbi say, isn't this an incredible way to think about it? And the Rambam actually codifies this halacha, right? The Rambam goes in and discusses this idea. He says, Beis Din V'Askenim Yoshem Beis HaKnesses says, ubodkim amase ansheir me'achar tfilas shachris and chatzos hayom. They would daven shachris, no kriyas haTorah. They would daven shachris, and literally again introspection from morning until chatzos. And introspection had two parts. First part, according to Rashi, personal introspection, then communal introspection. They would identify what are the stumbling blocks and ultimately remove them. And then the Rambam would go on. And Allah again describe the rest of the day from midday up until the next quarter. They would go ahead and they would read Torah and half Torah. Again, according to the Rambam, they would read the Tochacha, and then ultimately, again, the last part of the day, Mispalin Tfilas Mincha, or Mischanen and Vizwakim Misadan Kifi Kocham, and then they would daven the last quarter of the day. But I will say, incredibly profound, that the way they used to spend their communal fast days, the first chunk, the major chunk of the day, was spent in introspection, first individual introspection, and then communal introspection. I will say, you should be zocher to do the same. Stop over here, shkayach, everyone. Pick up with the Mishnah tomorrow, Mirza Hashem.